Hi there to you, welcome back to the channel here with me, Jenny Kirk, but we're not up in the loft with Weiryard. Today we're returning to our 009 project build. Now you might remember in the last video we dealt with the baseboards. They are all now done, and today what I'm going to be starting to do is what I'm going to call the subterrane. This is something where you're building up the landscape, but it's what's underneath the landscape holding it all together, and then putting that first layer on that then lets you deal with the scenic stuff. That's the plan for today. I've done a few bits of test fitting, but I'm going to be doing in the main is using these from Woodland Scenics, which they call risers. And these are great, as you can see, very, very flexible, and that's going to form the basis, firstly of our track bed, and then we're going to use that cake box that I showed you in the first episode. We're going to cut that up and use that as the basis for the mountain in the middle. So let's see how we get on. Come with me, I'm really looking forward to showing you part 2 of this build in association with the channel sponsor Train-O-Matic, makers of DCC decoders and accessories that are designed by enthusiasts for enthusiasts. I've done a test fit here, and you can see that I've got the first section of this Woodland Scenics risers put in place. This is the product. I've actually bought the 4-inch risers, but it's one of those things that sometimes during the planning you kind of change your plan. And having got these home, I'm beginning to think I should have bought the 2-inch risers. It's an easy mistake to make, but the Woodland Scenics risers are actually quite flexible in both directions. So normally you'd build them that way around, but I just felt that the 4-inch height was too much for this baseboard. There wasn't enough space to build the terrain up convincingly around it. So my plan is turn them on their side, and they're still flexible in that direction. And then what we're going to be using is I've got a hot wire cutter here, and you can see I've made a start around the edge here, and what that has allowed me to do is to just cut away some of that harsh edge. And I'm going to make another pass as well. I've got to be ever so careful not to cut back in too far to where the track will be going. Now the track doesn't go down just yet, but you can see that our test fitting, it does start to come together, but we do need to put a layer over this, otherwise you've got these big gaps, and when you come to ballast, your ballast will just fall right down. This area here is different. This is going to be the passing loop stroke station area. It's probably going to be the principal scenic area. And you can see here what I've done is where the point is going, because it just makes things a lot easier from the electrical side of things, I've actually fastened that down onto a scrap piece of wood and carefully distanced so it's the same height as the riser that's already been glued in here. And that gives us the firm basis for the point and the point motor underneath. But we're going to come to the track and electrics in a future video. But of course at this stage, this has to go in, so you'll see this random piece of track in place. One of the other things that I've done is over here, I've started using some of the scrap polystyrene from some of the Scenecraft pieces that I've bought for this layout. This is one of the narrow gauge tunnel mouths, and there's a few other bits and pieces, and the packaging is actually a great thing to use to just kind of fill in other odd gaps, and it comes in a variety of different thicknesses, so we can build up elements of scenery and this doesn't go to waste. Effectively think of this as free building materials. At this stage now, what I'm going to do is get the track base in using those Woodland Scenic risers, get that all the way round, glued and screwed in place so that we can let that glue set, and then we're going to build up the mountain in the middle. And for that we've got that cake box. Now we're not just going to dump this cake box in, but I'm actually going to use the hot wire cutter to just cut my way into this box and cut out the pieces that I need. It's as easy as that. This area here is quite simply been made out of some scrap pieces of plywood that I had to hand. So you can see paint doesn't matter, that's all going to disappear under ballast and other scenic stuff. I've mounted the point motor underneath, and I've chosen for this one of Peco's new twist lock point motors, and actually it's proven incredibly easy to get that lined up, because one of the things I found in the past is that the under baseboard design point motors can be really difficult to get lined up, but there's been no problems whatsoever with this. Around here, this is just going to be plain track, so I'm going to use these leftover bits of packaging, which are just the right height, and I'm going to glue them together, and then over here there will be another small piece of plywood that needs to go in, so that we can get the other point in place. One of the other things that I want to do in this build, and it's something that's quite an eye-catching bridge on the Festiniog Railway at Tanabooth. There's one of these Victorian-style cast-iron bridges. Now, I've got the Wills kit here, number SS26, and I want to add this into the build. And I want the approaches to it to be that characteristic North Wales narrow gauge railway slate built embankment, and it's kind of like a tall, thin, rough slate built walls that carries the railway on top. Very characteristic of the Festiniog Railway. So what I'm going to do with this is I've got a bit of surplus packaging here from one of the Scenecraft items that I've picked up. And what I've discovered is that the interior packaging plus the lid of the inside of the packaging put together is exactly the right height to match up with the scenic risers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this carefully in half with a little saw, and then I've got either side of where the bridge is going to go. I'm then going to very carefully measure the width of the cast iron abutment, so I leave a gap for those, and then at a later date that will become a feature, and I'm going to have a kind of rough river stroke stream passing underneath it, and that gives us the opportunity for a water feature in this build, which I think is going to look absolutely great. And I rather like the idea of having a waterfall down into a plunge pool and then having the outflow from that pass underneath the bridge, and it will be a little bit reminiscent of, again, another location on the Festiniog Railway where the deviation was built. There's a point where there's a bridge across a stream and the train passes by a very picturesque waterfall. In fact, when we went and travelled on the Festiniog Railway, that was one of the scenic features that caught our eye. But that is something we're going to incorporate for interest on the other side of the layout. So I'm going to get on and I will add that in to the build as well. I've got the risers in now, and that gives us the basic level for the track. It wasn't as easy as I was hoping, actually. It's taken me a lot longer, but they did go down in the end. Part of this issue was using 4-inch risers when actually I should have had 2-inch. But it's okay, it's all worked out now. I've got the station area in and complete, and now what I'm trying to do is work out how to build the mountain area in the corner. So I've started to hack up the cake box, and this is going to become the kind of strong, actually, structure that fits in around the risers in there. It fits right to the corner, and I've now got to just work out what I've got to cut away from this just to get the profiles right. It will disappear underneath the PVA and J cloth in time, but until then, it's just kind of forming the structure that then allows the track to pass underneath. It is quite tricky, but helped by having a hot wire cutter. and it's coming along quite well. So I'm just going to keep working at this, whittling it down until I'm happy with what I've got. It's been a tough, hard slog, but you can see how that cake box, which was, well, box-shaped, has turned into the interior of the mountain. It's been really difficult because there's that big hole in the middle of the baseboard. If you guys were doing this, I'd say don't put the hole in the middle of the baseboard, but we were constrained by using scrap wood. Didn't want to buy anything new for this, so we've kind of just owned it and made it our own. At this stage now, it looks like some kind of weird white polystyrene Escher creation, but actually, once we get the J-cloth with PVA on here, it's going to start to look all right because it's going to smooth down some of those contours. I also want to make use of another product that I have, and this is the Woodland Scenics Shaper Sheet. Now, I've used this before up on Weir Yard, and as you can see, it's effectively self-supporting foil on the back, and then it has attached to it this bandage, and what we then do is we impregnate this with a coat of plaster. It sets, and it is freestanding and very, very strong. And what that actually will do is, on the side that I'm going to use this, we're not actually going to have any real problems, even if the polystyrene underneath starts to break apart, because this is actually freestanding. So I'm going to go ahead, and on one side I'm going to prep it up with some scrap cardboard just to provide something for that J-cloth to kind of be held on until the PVA sets. And on the other, I'm going to staple gun some of this in, and it's also going to allow me to try and create some of those contours for the waterfall area and the stream and the runoff and the plunge pool from that. So actually, I think it should really come together quite quickly. Once I've got all that in place, then it's a case of letting it dry and then going over with a layer of filler. I've got some really cheap DIY filler. You don't want the expensive stuff because it doesn't make any difference. And I've also got some brown poster paint, which I'm going to mix in with that. And the reason for this is when your terrain is gone on, the brown just gives you that lovely earthy base coat. It also means that if it chips, you don't get glaring bits of white showing through, which we don't really want. This is the product, Shaper Sheet Plaster, and this again is from Woodland Scenics. So we just need to mix up a nice mix of this stuff, and then we can start putting it on. So let's just pour a load out. So we've got a big area to cover, but don't take on too much at a time. Add a little bit of water in. And this is actually a chemical reaction, so when you see it bubbling, some of that is the actual reaction itself. It can be a little bit difficult to get the mix just right. And remember now, at this stage we're on the clock. I'm not answering phone calls or anything, because once this starts to set, nothing stops it. I tend to like it a little bit more watery. I find that that makes it a little bit easier to work with. You might want to make it a little bit stiffer than this, but we're kind of getting a whipped cream consistency. Just getting that all mixed in. You can see actually all that powder does reduce down a little bit. And now it's a case of roll your sleeves up and we are on the go. Basically, you've got about 10 to 15 minutes before this starts to set and becomes unusable. So at this stage, it's just simply a case of starting to add it to the shaper sheet. And this soaks into the bandage layer. And just to be certain on this, what I may also do is go over with a layer of filler as part of the next stage, just to make sure that this is what all of this will set with. I'm making sure all of the different bits are stuck together. What I've actually found is that using my fingers is a good way to just really work this plaster into the bandage that's on this shaper sheet. And sometimes if you've got too hard an implement, it's just really, really tough. So hopefully this is going to slowly build this up. And like I said before, I'm going to use some filler at a later point just to make sure that the topography is exactly as I want. I've got the plaster on and it's now setting actually quite quickly. I reached a point where I was just using the last of the plaster up and I could feel that you kind of get a gritty texture to it and it doesn't flow as well as you'd want. So I was just finishing off. One of the other things as well that I've gone and done is I've used some newspaper with some of the plaster and used this to just smooth across some of the joins that were apparent to me. And hopefully that will mean that we've got a much nicer, smoother terrain once this all sets. But I'm going to stop and have something to eat now, and then I'll come back and I need to get the J-cloth and PVA, which is a different method to ultimately achieve much the same thing, done on this side of the layout. It's day 2 of this particular build, so I've left the plaster to set overnight. It's actually got a bit darker, which is how we know it's set. It has been a bit chilly in the night, so some of the glue is still a little bit tacky, but that's okay. We're going to throw loads more PVA at this, and then what we're actually going to do is move it in front of the fire to dry out and make sure it's really lovely and dry. And we've got that luxury that we can do that because it is still a really good portable layout. Now what I'm doing next is this is another technique that you can use for making your scenery. You kind of build up that polystyrene like we did for the Shaper sheet and plaster, but instead of going down that route, get yourself some cheap J-cloths. Don't have to be branded, in fact probably better if they're not branded, and these act a bit like a very cheap bandage, but instead of using plaster with these, we're going to use cheap PVA. This is the PVA I've got. I got it from a shop called The Range. Probably get it elsewhere, but it's cheap and it's in bulk, and we're going to use a lot of this, so don't get expensive brands. Again, cheap is just as good as expensive when it comes to what we're planning to do. Now before we start getting messy, I'm preparing the J-cloths. You don't want all of them as the big full sheets. They do come quite big, so I've got a little pile here. These are cut into quarters, so they're really good for tight spots. I've got another pile here where I've cut them into halves, and that's good for the bulk of the mountain. We won't need quite so many of those, but once we get started, your hands will get covered in glue, so you don't want to be having to mess about going, oh, I need some more. So let's get nicely prepared. And we're going to be putting down multiple layers of these, so if you find you've got a few too many, just keep going, use some more. That's the best way to do it. These are pretty cheap, and that's the best thing about this particular method. It does take a lot longer to set, and this was actually suggested to me by Alan Reynolds, so I will name check him in this video. Known forevermore in the Monday Club as PVA J-Cloth Alan. And a big thank you to you for putting me onto this really great, cheap, but effective method of doing scenery. So I'm going to get all these done and prepared, and then we're going to move on to the fun bit, which is where we get messy with the PVA. So if you have a small child, this is a good time to deploy them because they love a bit of mess. So I've got the same bowl here that I used for the plaster. I've knocked all the loose plaster I can out, and then we're going to get that cheap PVA, and we're going to need quite a lot of this, so we are going to just pour it in, plenty of it. Now let's just put this to one side, and then I'm going to need to mix in a little bit of water just to thin that down ever so slightly. You don't want too much, otherwise it'll go too thin, but then stick your hand in and mix this for a bit. You'll start to see it thin down ever so slightly. If you still feel it's maybe a little bit too thick, don't be frightened of adding a bit more water. It's not a problem. Just mix this up. And I think A little bit of water actually. And this is, can I just say, this is very, very cold. So it occurs to me that warm water might go a long way to just make this a little bit easier, but never mind. So we get the first of our cloths, and it's just like making the, if you use the plaster bandage method, I guess. But we're going to put that in there and then squeeze a lot of this glue out. You don't want it absolutely sopping wet. Like I say, this is perfect for a small child to play with. Or the small child that still exists inside all of us, wondering what went wrong over the last 40 years. And then we spread this out, and the J cloth has a great strength to it. And then smooth that down over the subterrane that we've got into place. Just get that in, down, round, over the edges, smooth it in. And then this is just rinse and repeat, and we keep going. We're going to do over the track bed as well, so we get rid of all of these little gaps. And then when we come to lay the track, then we're good for having a base that we can ballast without the ballast falling through. Now I'm going to leave a little area just here free, because in the next episode I'll be dealing with some of the electrics, and I've got a piece to go in there, so we'll leave a little bit free, but for now let's just get on and get all this covered. We're also going to leave a bit of a gap where the tunnel mouths go. We can't put them in finally until after we sort out the track, and then we'll just touch up with a little bit more of this method just to fill in around the tunnel mouths once the track is in and tested. It's been a big job, but as you can see, it has transformed the model. So we've got the J cloth with the PVA mix all over. We've got the track bed done apart from the little gap around here. And it's transformed some of the, what were just blocks of polystyrene, into something that you can actually believe will become an actual landscape. So we're going to let this dry now. There's one of the downsides of the PVA J cloth method is that you do need to leave it probably for about a week just to make sure before we move on to the next stage. So even though the polyfillet with the brown paint that gives us the final terrain over the top is technically part of the subterrane, we're going to carry that over into the next part of this video, where we're going to be dealing with laying the track, ballasting that, getting the electrics in, and really getting us to a point where what we have is very visibly a working model railway. So I hope you'll join us again for episode 3 of this series. It's been great fun. I hope it's been great fun for you as well. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And you stay safe now, and happy modelling. Until then, you take great care. Bye for now. Today's video is sponsored by Train-O-Matic, makers of DCC decoders designed to be fully compatible with every manufacturer's locomotive. Visit train-o-matic.com to browse the full range and see what they've got suitable for you. I'd like to send out a huge thanks to everybody who supports me on Patreon, and an extra special huge thanks goes out to Anthony Kidson, Michael Churchwood, Anthony Hunt, William Wade, Wayne Johns, Offshore Allen, oorail.co.uk, Tepic, Michael Lockie, Helen Sink, Peter Bolton, Brian Smith, Brian and Dorothy Mudd, Gary Lewis, David Quinn, Trish Bits, Sparky 107107, George Botterini, Andy Finch, Chris Moss, Robert Sears, MD of San Juan Model Company and Grant Line Products, Sam Yates, and Dale Williams. Thank you. Without you guys, I couldn't do this.